Paper was like gold in medieval times.
Oh, not tobacco. Sugar.
That everything we thought we knew about the world might turn out to be completely wrong.
On June the 2nd, 1985, police were called to a lumber yard in San Francisco to apprehend a shoplifter. When they got there, the suspect, Charles Ng, had fled, but his partner, Leonard Lake, was still at the scene.
Lake and Ng are a dominant and subservient pair of lust killers. One having the lust fantasy, the other going along with the lust fantasy.
Leonard Lake was arrested. Then, in custody, he swallowed a cyanide pill and died before he could answer for his crimes.
Leonard Lake becomes obsessed with having women as his sex slaves, keeping women in an enclave.
Investigators soon discovered that Lake and Ng had a sinister secret. They were, in fact, a serial-killing duo with a hidden bunker where they kidnapped, raped, tortured, and murdered men, women, and children.
The horror that they go through when you actually see it on video, to actually see a woman begging for her baby and asking for her baby.
Serial-killing partners Leonard Lake and Charles Ng had carved their names in infamy as two of the world's most evil killers. It was a serial-killing spree that horrified a nation and terrified the citizens of San Francisco, California. In just 11 months between July 1984 and June 1985, friends, neighbors, and entire families, women, men, and children, vanished without a trace. In that time, 11 innocent people were later proved to have been kidnapped and killed. Many were also tortured and raped by the serial-killing pair Leonard Lake and Charles Ng.
Team serial killers make up around a quarter of the serial murder cases in the US. But the difference with Ng and Lake is that this particular serial killing team got away with a lot of murders before they were apprehended.
The MO was this. They would answer an ad in a paper. Usually the ad was for some merchandise that they needed. They would kidnap whoever was selling the merchandise, take the merchandise, use the woman for their sexual pleasure. They would make her a slave, and whoever the man was that was with her would be summarily killed.
When investigators searched the killer's cabin in the northern Californian woods, they found what they thought to be the remains of at least 11 corpses that had been buried in shallow graves. Ed Erdulatz was with the San Francisco Police Department at the time.
I spent 23 years of my career in homicide, worked a lot of murder cases, but this is right at the top of the list of being one of the most difficult to deal with personally.
These two were incredibly cold. They really didn't care. And the way that they treated their victims, they humiliated them, they tortured them. This was what they thought was fun.
The story of the serial-killing duo began just over 70 years ago in 1945. The elder of the pair, Leonard Lake, was born in the wake of World War II. Lake had a troubled childhood.
His family have got a history of working in the US Navy. They move around a lot. There's quite a lot of volatility in the family unit, quite a lot of drinking.
Age 6, Lake's parents separated, and he and his siblings were sent to live with their grandparents. There, his grandmother allegedly encouraged some lewd behavior.
He, as a boy, had been encouraged by his grandmother to take naked pictures of his sisters, And I think that this gave him this fixation that meant that he was always, to some extent, wanted to manipulate women.
As a young man, Lake developed his own unhealthy urges.
Leonard Lake identified with a book by John Fowles called The Collector, which was written in 1963. And basically, the story of The Collector was a clerk called Frederick Clegg. He collected butterflies. And for some reason, suddenly developed a fixation on a girl called Miranda and decides to abduct Miranda so that she becomes part of his butterfly collection.
Lake becomes obsessed with having women as his sex slaves, keeping women in an enclave that he's going to develop because he's going to survive a nuclear Armageddon.
In 1965, aged 19, Lake joined the US Marine Corps and served 2 tours in the Vietnam War as a radar operator.
I think it tipped him over the edge, the possibility that he would find himself in close combat fighting, and essentially snapped. And that was the genesis of the man that became really a ferocious killer.
In 1971, Lake was diagnosed with schizoid personality disorder and was given a medical discharge. He re-emerged in San Francisco, where he began to explore his dark fantasies.
He married in San Francisco in 1975. His wife finally couldn't stand him because he made amateur porn films. A lot of sadomasochism, a lot of bondage. His wife was very upset by that and effectively threw him out.
In 1977, still in the San Francisco Bay Area, Lake met his second wife. Nicknamed Cricket, she indulged his peculiar habits.
Cricket was an active participant in his, again, amateur porn films and appeared in many of them.
This is the thing about abusive men like Leonard Lake. They're not abusive all of the time. They're able to charm, they're able to manipulate, they're able to spin a good story to people who they want to support them.
15 years younger, Charles Ng seemed an unlikely choice for a friend.
Charles Ng was born in Hong Kong in 1960, the son of a wealthy Chinese businessman, a harsh disciplinarian. One of Ng's releases was to be a kleptomaniac. He stole things. He stole things because it made him feel better about himself. And he did it repeatedly.
Aged 15, Ng was sent to a boarding school in England, but it did not go well.
Charles Ng's family were consistently embarrassed by him, so he was moved around from school to school. He ended up at a boarding school in Yorkshire, where he carried on with this behaviour. He did academically well for a while, so he was a child who was quite bright. But he just couldn't help himself in terms of stealing and create all of this chaos, and I think he was quite enjoying that.
In 1978, aged 18, Ng moved to the US on a student visa. He moved to California to study, but he soon got into trouble again. He was involved in a hit and run. In October 1979, aged 18, Charles Ng was arrested and forced to pay for the damages. Then, in a strange twist, a year later, the Hong Kong resident and British citizen lied about his nationality and joined the US Marine Corps. But less than a year after he joined, old habits resurfaced.
In 1982, when by this time Ng was 22, he was arrested for stealing explosives and weaponry.
Ng was sentenced to 14 years in military detention in Hawaii. It was while he was in jail that Ng formed an uncommon friendship with Leonard Lake.
Ng was in military detention and he was reading a magazine, and there was an ad in this magazine Leonard Lake had placed in there, and he responded to this ad. So it was a real chance encounter. And you wonder, had he not have been reading that particular magazine, had he have been in a different place, that these two would never have come together. But they did meet and they wreaked absolute havoc.
Lake's post, advertising weapons he had for sale, appeared to have been the basis of their friendship.
As is so often the case, weapons are a fascination to many people, many of whom have a sense of insecurity. They feel that weapons give them a sense of power. So I think that what really linked the two was a fascination with weapons.
The details are murky, but somehow Ing stayed in touch with Lake, who became a mentor for the young would-be killer.
I think what Ing found in him was a kind of surrogate father, someone who would understand him. He was suggestible enough to fall under the spell of a man of a stronger, older disposition, which Lake certainly was.
Charles Ing managed to escape from military detention in early 1983.
And the one person he deserted to run away to was Lake, who was living at this point in a mobile home in Northern California.
However, the net was closing in. An FBI SWAT team arrived by helicopter, raided the mobile home, and arrested Charles Ing. They made a discovery that would also get Lake arrested: illegal firearms. But Lake was freed on bail and then went into hiding in California. His friend Ing was sent to the US State Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. After serving 18 months, he was dishonorably discharged and released in 1984. That same year, the two friends reunited. Charles Ing moved into Lake's new remote ranch in the Northern Californian wilderness.
It was the combination of the two individuals that made them into the terrible killing machine that they became.
Here, Lake and Ing shared their depraved fantasies, and together they devised a fearsome plan to murder men, women, and even infants on an industrial scale. On the grounds of the 2-acre property, Lake had built a subterranean bunker for his and his partner Ing's murderous purpose.
In Calaveras County, east of San Francisco, where, effectively, Lake set up the dungeon that he'd always wanted for his Operation Miranda, where Ing came to join him.
Based on Lake's obsession with the book The Collector, the pair teamed up to put Leonard Lake's fearsome fantasy, his so-called Miranda plan, into motion.
The Miranda plan was the means by which he was going to be the one who fathered all the new children in the world after the nuclear Armageddon had happened and he was in his enclave with all of his sex slaves.
That's what he was creating with Ing, and that's what he had been fantasizing for 20 years before he met Ing. The project's aim is to capture your ideal woman, enslave her, and have her be your sexual slave until you're done with her, at which time you kill her. In the case of Ing and Lake, the killings involve much more than killings, much more than just sex. They involve torture, they involve the photographing of victims. It was a nightmare that somebody from Hollywood could not dream up for a horror movie.
Ing arrives, and in a sense, they combust the fantasy because they start saying to each other, what we need is to have lots of children to repopulate the world and make better citizens, a kind of social engineering project through a very odd prism.
Ing was a very shy person who himself could not have done this, but happily joined the venture so that he would have a chance of the kind of sexuality his shyness made impossible.
On July the 25th, 1984, Lake and Ing's perverse Miranda plan was begun. The first woman they were thought to have abducted and enslaved was Deborah Dubbs. The duo would in fact murder her, her husband Harvey, and their 16-month-old son Sean. Answering an ad for video equipment, Lake and Ing showed up at their apartment in San Francisco. The pair likely killed Harvey and the baby soon after. Lake and Ing then kidnapped 33-year-old Deborah and took her back to their underground bunker.
In the case of the Dubbs, family. They took all of their photographic equipment. Mr. Dubs used to do photography work on the side. They abducted his wife and raped her.
In Wilseyville, in Calaveras County, Lake and Ing kept Deborah prisoner. In what would become their modus operandi, the callous killing team would torture, defile, and humiliate Deborah. They would subsequently subject all their female victims to the same awful acts.
The women are made to disrobe. They're told they will cooperate or they'll be killed.
They construct a one-way mirror so they can watch her. She is literally a specimen, which they can abuse, obviously rape, keep, and even more horrifying, they video it. They video her ordeal, subjecting her to an equally awful, degrading humiliation over a period of weeks.
The pair used a hog-tying technique to restrain their abductees.
Hog tying involves binding the ankles and binding the wrists and neck with somebody face down and their legs bent. So if they try and straighten their legs, it places pressure on the neck. So it is a vicious method of restraining somebody and extremely painful and extremely cruel.
Lake seemed to be the more domineering of the two.
It's clear that Lake is the one that's giving the instructions and telling Charlie what to do. And if Charlie doesn't do something quick enough, Lake kind of takes him to task. But Ing was a very willing participant.
I think Ing, he'd always had these sort of violent fantasies and he wanted to get involved in this kind of thing, and now he's able to, and he's got somebody to follow.
Lake and Ing are a dominant and subservient pair of lust killers. One having the lust fantasy, the other going along with the lust fantasy.
The pair derive great pleasure from the horror they were inflicting on the innocent.
Victims of kidnapping will often try and identify with their kidnappers. They'll try and develop a connection with them. They'll give them information about them. It was never going to work with Lake and Ing because they were emotionally turned off.
After weeks of torture, Lake and Ing shot and murdered Deborah.
Life means nothing. At that moment that the killing takes place, they can barely understand that this is a living person in front of them.
It plays to the deepest fears of every woman, that she is simply being subjugated, humiliated, used. She is simply there as a plaything of these two men. Eventually they tire and kill her.
But their lust for blood was not confined to enslaving, then murdering women for their Miranda plan. Lake and Ing also preyed on single men too. With Lake skipping bail and now in hiding, they would randomly kill men, then steal their money, their driver's licenses, and their identities. One such victim was 34-year-old Randy Jacobson. Unemployed, he had placed an ad to try and sell his van.
Most of the murders were committed in Calaveras, but most of the victims were from San Francisco. They were either kidnapped and taken up to Calaveras, or they were lured up there with a promise of work or some other incentive. And then they would kill them and murder them, and then began to collect their Social Security type benefits.
In October 1984, shortly after Leonard Lake answered his ad, Randy Jacobson vanished. Around the same time, 38-year-old Donald Giletti had answered an ad too. This time it was posted by Charles Ing and offered free sex. The San Francisco DJ responded, and he was later found murdered in his own home. He was shot 3 times. Donald's roommate would later identify Charles Ing as the killer. By the end of 1984, 6 months since the Miranda plan began, Ing and Lake's lust for murder knew no bounds.
Ing and Lake were just the worst possible two to ever get together. I think they fed off each other. I think they both enjoyed what they were doing. And I think their enjoyment by doing it together was actually increased exponentially.
Sometimes they get bored, so they start preying on their neighbours. So obviously these are people with families, with friends, with employers who are going to miss them, who are going to alert the authorities. But I think it's because they feel invincible at this point in time, and they think they're just going to keep getting away with it.
One of the things that they did that is extraordinary is before killing a woman, if the woman had connections, she had a job, she had a husband, they would have the woman in her own hand write a letter saying she was going away, taking a job in another city and wouldn't be coming back. And they sent it to the employer, the friend, the husband, so that they wouldn't know that she was actually missing and dead. This is the kind of careful planning that they did.
In April 1985, Lake and Ing needed another woman to satisfy their deviant desires and fulfill their Miranda plan. This time, the victims would simply be targets of opportunity. Their neighbour, Brenda O'Connor, her partner, Lonnie Bond, and their one-year-old infant son, Lonnie Jr.
Bond and O'Connor and their son are presumably invited to Lake and Ing's cabin. And pretty speedily, the two dispatch both father and infant son, kill them, and they make the girlfriend, Brenda O'Connor, a prisoner.
After weeks of torture, they murdered Brenda O'Connor. June the 2nd, 1985, San Francisco, California. For the last 11 months, Leonard Lake and Charles Ing had indulged their depraved fantasies. They included kidnap, rape, torture, and murder. But on this fateful summer's day, the pair walked into a lumber yard to buy supplies for their atrocious activities. When Charles Ing was caught stealing a table vise from the store, it would be the beginning of their end. The police were now involved.
Charles Ing goes on the run. He literally just abandons his partner in crime. It's all about his own self-preservation now.
Ing ran away. Lake stayed and tried to talk his way out of the shoplifting incident. And the South San Francisco police officer went to the car to recover the vise and also found a .22 pistol in the back.
They found that Leonard Lake's firearm was fitted with an illegal silencer. With their suspicions piqued, the police took Leonard Lake into custody.
Lake is now in a pretty fragile state, and I suspect realizes that the whole thing is going to unravel.
As soon as they brought him in and he asked for a piece of paper and a pencil, and you're thinking as an investigator, maybe he's ready to sign a confession. So great, I'll go run and get him a piece of paper and a pencil. And then when you come back, he's dead on the floor.
What investigators did not know yet was that Lake had acted before his awful secret was discovered.
He did not want to go to the electric chair. And so Lake took the precaution of providing for himself cyanide pills in case he was ever captured, which he sewed into his jacket.
It's clear that Leonard Lake knew that he would kill himself when he got caught. He did all these terrible things, and he never wanted to stand up and face the consequences of them, so that he was ready and he had those cyanide tablets on him in the event he ever got caught.
Lake was dead, but his partner Ing was now on the run. The FBI and Interpol launched a national and international manhunt for Charles Ing. At the same time, they processed the license plate on the brown Honda that Leonard Lake had parked outside the lumber store.
After Leonard Lake kills himself, then they start kind of pulling on the string and everything starts unraveling.
Subsequently found out that the car had had switched license plate, and the car belonged to Paul Cosner. Paul Cosner was a man who lived in the Marina District in San Francisco. Last seen alive when he purportedly left the house to show a prospective buyer of his car to take them for a test drive. and he was never seen again.
A forensic examination of the Honda revealed a single bullet hole in the roof at the front of the car. It was surrounded with a blood splatter. Investigators also found a driver's license belonging to yet another San Francisco man who had disappeared.
The missing persons detectives from San Francisco were immediately notified. They went down to South San Francisco, and Inspector Irene Brunn and Tom Eisenman. So at that time, there was still no involvement in homicide.
Inside the brown Honda, investigators also found a utility bill in Lake's ex-wife's name for a place in Calaveras County in Northern California. The detectives questioned her about the electricity bill found in the car. The interview led them to a ranch with a log cabin in the wilderness, 150 miles east of San Francisco. The detectives didn't know what they would find, but they were aware of a number of missing persons cases in the region. One in particular stuck in their mind.
At the time, there were a couple of missing persons cases that were kind of unusual. One was this Dubs family, a family of three, were missing under very strange circumstances.
As they walked through the cabin, they noticed a bed with holes drilled in the posts and on the floor, seemingly for restraints. But that's not all that detectives Irene Brunn and Tom Eisenman found.
Irene Brunn noticed a VCR and some other electronic equipment that she thought resembled equipment that was missing from the Dubs home. And she ran the serial number of a couple of those items, and sure enough, she got a hit. So she knew at that point, not only had she linked Lake and Ing to Paul Cosner in the car, but now she'd linked them into yet another missing person, the Dubs family.
Thought to be the first victims of their Miranda plan, the entire Dubs family had disappeared 11 months earlier, murdered by Lake and Ing. Evidence of wrongdoing was mounting, and then the case took an even darker turn.
Until the missing persons investigators got to the cabin, there was no connection to the Dubs family. So once that link was established, then there were a connection to 4 probably murdered people.
What had begun as a response to a shoplifting incident was now a mass murder investigation, with Leonard Lake and his partner in crime, Charles Ing, the prime suspects.
So at that point, the case was transferred from missing persons to homicide. And my partner, Jeff Brosh, and I ended up heading up a team of probably about 20 investigators from San Francisco.
On June the 5th, 1985, a team of San Francisco and Calaveras County investigators returned to the cabin in the woods. It was just 3 days since Lake had killed himself and Ing had gone on the run.
The police get to the cabin and they begin a series of absolutely horrifying discoveries.
Armed with a warrant, they searched a subterranean bunker or so-called fallout shelter situated next to the cabin.
And it was built into the side of the hill. And when you entered this bunker, there was like a workshop and areas where tools were and so on.
On the walls, 21 photos of young women in various stages of undress. At the back of the workshop area, detectives found a false wall. Behind it, another sobering surprise.
There was like a cell area that had been built into the back of the bunker, in which we later learned that they would keep female captives there for a period of time before killing them.
They discovered the dungeon and the false room, which is hidden, and the two-way mirror and where the women had been kept.
Investigators meticulously searched the 2-acre property used as the pair's killing grounds.
They discovered 2 5-gallon drums which had been buried, one of which contains IDs, paraphernalia, for up to 25 people who might have been missing. And the other one contains Lake's journals for 1983 and 1984 and the videotapes of the victims.
Appallingly, the video showed in vivid detail the depths of depravity that Lake and Ing indulged in.
You can see how the victims are full of fear and just horrified. And I think they got off on that. That brings it to a whole new level. It was on a horrific level why you would want to tape this stuff. But if you view those tapes, they're quite disturbing.
Brenda O'Connor, she had a little baby, and on the video, she is repeatedly distraught and asking Leonard Lake and Charles Ng, "What have you done with my baby? Where's my baby?" It's very difficult to watch.
But that wasn't all. During the search of the grounds, investigators made a gruesome discovery: human remains.
My partner, Jeff Brosh, pretty much stayed up in Calaveras, and he worked with the detectives up there. And what they were doing at that point was uncovering a lot of evidence that had been buried. We know, of course, that the videos and the gun and the journals had been buried, and they began finding more bodies.
You can see that as their killing went along, in the beginning they're very organised, they're kind of sticking to the rules that they've made up. But towards the end they are getting quite careless, they are getting quite sloppy, and we are able to identify particular victims from some of that evidence that they left.
Detectives found buried in shallow graves what they thought to be at least 11 bodies, as well as fragments that suggested there was a 12th body. Lake and Ng had disposed of all the evidence they thought might lead back to them.
And what Lake and Ng did is they buried all the contents of their neighbor's cabin in the trench and covered it up. They wanted the authorities to think that Brenda O'Connor, who was the woman with her baby, and her boyfriend and a friend, Scott Stapley, had just left the area and moved on.
The detectives were both identifying the victims whilst at the same time trying to determine the cause of death.
They definitely shot people. They also, in addition to burying a lot of the bodies, they chopped them up and put them in piles and burned them. One of the things that the detectives up in Calaveras were finding a lot of were little small bone chips that had previously been burned. I believe they had a big bonfire. So in some of the cases, it's hard to definitely determine what the exact cause of death was, because the bodies had been so badly burned and chopped up.
In all, the team gathered 45 pounds of charred remains. They belonged to at least 11 victims killed in the 11-month spree, including 6 men, 3 women, and 2 babies. All had been identified.
Ng and Lake, one of the most unusual things is that they were said to have fed some of the remains of their victims to chickens, of all things. It actually makes a kind of perverse sense. If you've burnt a body, you're left mainly with bone, it can be ground up, and that's the sort of thing a chicken could eat.
Now that investigators knew about the terrible crimes that Lake and Ng had callously committed, they had to catch the fugitive serial killer, Charles Ng.
Ng leaves and runs, crosses the border into Canada, Calgary, to where his sister lives.
Leonard Lake had committed suicide, but his serial killing partner Charles Ng was still alive, and detectives were now determined to catch him. It would not take long. Over 1,200 miles away, and less than a month after he fled San Francisco, Ng would succumb to his shoplifting urges once again. This time, it would lead to the serial killer's demise. July the 6th, 1985, Calgary, Canada. The net was closing in on Charles Ng.
Based upon information one of his associates had given to the FBI, we felt he probably had gone across the border up into Canada. So his picture was being distributed up there.
Now, Canada, the FBI has international offices in Canada, so when somebody like Ng flees there, the FBI can be on it fairly quickly.
Less than a month after he fled the San Francisco Bay Area, Charles Ng fatefully succumbed to one of his urges.
That strain of kleptomania that had run through his childhood didn't disappear in adulthood. And indeed, it was Ng's kleptomania that in the end saw him caught and brought to justice. And it's almost pathetic. He goes and he steals a can of salmon in a supermarket.
And a couple of store detectives approach him, and he was armed, and he pulled out his gun and shot one of the store clerks.
The security guard manages to hang on to him despite having been shot in the hand, and the police are called. Ing is taken. And then, almost immediately, they realise that they have the man that the American authorities want.
But getting Ing back to the United States to face justice would take years of litigation.
Ing actually committed a crime in Canada, so he has to face justice in Canada like any other criminal would before they're willing to consider sending him to the US.
Charles Ing was sentenced to 4.5 years for attempted murder and shoplifting. He served his time in Canada and he fought tooth and nail to stay in the country.
Ing knew how to make the process work for him, and delaying and delaying. He told one of his cellmates, I think, that all I have to do is fire my lawyers and I get another extension. And so he tried that a few times. So he really was able to sit in that Canadian jail and really work the system.
When you look at Ing's behaviour when he's facing these really serious charges, it's still me, me, me. He's only concerned about himself. He's trying to dodge extradition. He's trying to kind of create a bit of drama around his case. So now that he's incarcerated, he loses quite a lot of control over many things in his life, but he will cling on to those last vestiges of power. So the things that he can exert control over, he's going to.
6 years later, in 1991, Ing was finally sent to California to answer for his crimes and those of his serial killing partner, Leonard Lake.
By now, he's become very adept indeed at the ways of the law, and he starts a series of battles with the Californian state authorities.
And if you look at some of his behaviour at this time, it's incredibly arrogant, it's very narcissistic. He's complaining about the length of the commute to the courthouse. He's moaning about the food. He's complaining about a whole host of things that he feels wronged by, that he feels entitled to. So here's somebody who really can't see beyond the end of their own nose.
In California, Charles Ing continued his fight to stay out of the courts for another 7 painstaking years.
Took a long time. It was to the families. It was a frustrating time.
He's not going to make a very easy time of it for the people who are looking after him in prison, and he's going to be a nightmare for his lawyers and the legal teams that are involved in this.
By the time Charles Ing faced trial in October 1998, Leonard Lake had been dead for 13 years. But he had left a series of diaries written in his own hand and found at the scene of the crime. After they deciphered some coded entries, investigators were certain that Lake had committed several murders on his own.
Many of these crimes were referred to in code. He would code name different planned killings or crimes with names. One was Fish, Operation Fish, and we finally determined that in addition to the women that Lake and Ing had kidnapped and raped, there was a crime, several murders that Leonard Lake had committed before he and Charles Ing hooked up for their 11-month crime spree.
Acting alone, Lake likely murdered his brother in early 1983. Donald Lake had disappeared in April of that year. Lake's best man, Charles Gunner, vanished in 1983 too, but the exact date he was killed is still a mystery. But just 1 month before Ing went on trial, in September 1998, Charles Gunner's body was found buried on the 2-acre property, 15 years after the fact.
We did find, kind of inadvertently found Charles Gunner's body up on the property, and it was when I think it was a phone company or PG&E crew came through doing work that some of their equipment unearthed Charles Gunner's grave.
Long gone, Lake would never face trial for the crimes he had committed, but his serial killing partner Charles Ing would. On October the 26th, 1998, in the Santa Ana, California courthouse, 14 years after his killing spree began, Ng finally faced trial. To secure a conviction, a 36-foot-long truck full of evidence was ferried 400 miles south to the courtroom in Orange County in Southern California. Having found what they assumed to be 12 burnt bodies, Ng was being prosecuted on 12 counts of murder.
The evidence was so overwhelming. When you consider the fact that you had him on film with a number of the victims telling them that he was going to kill them, along with all of the other evidence that was found, it was a pretty rock-solid case. I went down to Orange County and testified. And in fact, he never made eye contact with me, and I never saw him really make eye contact with anybody else. He just kind of looked down the entire time.
In February 1999, nearly 17 years after the serial killers began their murderous pursuits, Charles Ng was convicted on 11 counts of homicide. The jury found him guilty of murdering 6 men, 3 women, and 2 infant children. They deadlocked on the 12th count. There was simply not enough evidence for the jury to convict him.
He's convicted of killing 11, including 2 infants, 3 women, and 6 men. Ng is sentenced to death, but he's now on death row in San Quentin.
When, if ever that ever happens, is anybody's guess. But that's where he is. But at least he's locked away. I don't think he'll ever get out.
More than 30 years on, and the memories of the mass murders perpetrated by partners Leonard Lake and Charles Ng still plague the homicide detectives who worked on the case.
After a while, you become somewhat hardened, I guess, but when you're dealing with small children or babies, they're just innocent people taken advantage of and abducted. And then you see the horror that they go through. Then to actually see a woman begging for her baby and asking for her baby, that's very unusual and very difficult to deal with.
When I look at the Lake and Ng case, we've got a meeting of 2 incredibly twisted minds here, and together they created this alternative, depraved reality. But I think the scariest thing is these 2 weren't mad, they weren't crazy, they knew exactly what they were doing, and yet they chose to do it anyway. And the thought of people deciding and choosing to do the things they did really does chill me to the bone.
It's, a really good thing that shoplifting incident happened, because that's what was the domino that fell to start the whole process, or else these guys may still be out there.
The suicide of Leonard Lake and the conviction of Charles Ng finally brought an end to the serial killing spree. But the lessons learned by investigators will hopefully help them catch and convict the next murderous pair before they too join the ranks of the world's most evil killers.